October 25th, 2013. A plain red brick apartment building off Brixton Road. To the average passerby, it was just another aging corner of Lambeth. But on that evening, the Metropolitan Police, tipped off by a mysterious phone call, entered the premises with cautious urgency. Inside, they found 3 women in a dazed, almost trance-like state. None resisted, none spoke loudly, but all of them had just been freed from what authorities would later describe as the most extreme case of domestic slavery ever uncovered in modern British history. You probably can't even imagine the full scale of it. These women had lived through over 3 decades of coercive control, not handcuffs and chains, but something much more terrifying, an invisible prison crafted from ideology, psychological domination, and absolute fear. They weren't kept in cages, but they couldn't leave. One of them had never left the flat in her entire life. So before we get started, I'll ask you to subscribe to the channel and put a like on the video if you really like what I'm doing. And after you've watched this case to the end, let me know in the comments. What shocked you most? When the officers first stepped inside, they were struck not by violence, but by the eerie quietness. No struggle, no resistance, just 3 women, aged 30, 57, and 69, standing almost motionless. One of them whispered a phrase that would later haunt the detectives: "We're not allowed to go outside." This wasn't a raid on a drug house or a trafficking ring. This was something darker, more insidious. Modern slavery disguised as ideology hidden in plain sight. The suspects? An elderly couple known in the neighborhood, not for crime, but for their political views and communal lifestyle. What made these women stay? What did they believe would happen if they left? The 3 women rescued that night came from different continents, different decades, and vastly different beginnings, but all ended up inside the same locked room. First, there was Josephine Heriville, 57, an Irish national and the daughter of a celebrated wartime codebreaker. Then Aisha Wahab, 69, a Malaysian woman who arrived in the UK in the 1960s to study, only to vanish from public view. And finally, the youngest was Rosie Davies, just 30 years old at the time of the rescue. Her name wasn't in any public record. She had no school history, no GP registration, no bank account. Rosie had been born into captivity, raised behind curtains, raised to believe the outside world was poison. All 3 were bound not by force, but by fear, and an unshakable belief that their captor controlled life and death. Over the decades, their identities were slowly eroded, their wills broken. They were told the government was an evil force out to kill them, that police were agents of torture, that they would be hunted and killed if they ever tried to flee. These weren't hollow threats. This was indoctrination refined over decades. Rosie, in particular, was a puzzle for detectives. She barely understood how the world worked. When officers explained the concept of money to her, she thought they were lying. She had never used a phone, never seen a doctor, never tasted a restaurant meal. She was the ghost child of Lambeth, conceived, born, and raised in silence. The older women, Josephine and Aisha, had once been idealistic students drawn to radical left-wing politics. They joined what they thought was a revolutionary collective. What they found instead was a cult, led by a man who convinced them that obedience was liberation. What allows a person to give up their identity so completely? And what kind of leader thrives in that vacuum? The commune was not a sprawling compound or an underground dungeon. It was a single South London flat, window blinds always drawn, mail left to pile at the door. But inside, it operated like a totalitarian microstate. The ideology, Maoism, but twisted into something unrecognizable. The man at the center, Aravindan Balakrishnan, referred to himself not just as a leader, but as Comrade Bala, the spiritual commander of what he claimed was an anti-imperialist resistance cell. In truth, it was a dictatorship of one man's delusions. The group began in the 1970s as a Maoist splinter faction. They preached about revolution, anti-colonial struggle, and Western oppression. But as Balakrishnan's paranoia deepened, the group shrank, until only a few remained. Those who stayed became subjects in his private kingdom. He ruled through a concept he called the discipline of love, a euphemism for domination and fear. Members were told that death awaited those who disobeyed, and that a mystical force named Jackie, a fictional satellite system, could kill or reward them based on Bala's command. His followers, once politically active, became isolated, first from the leftist circles they used to engage with, then from friends and family, and finally from reality itself. No newspapers, no television, no books except those approved by Bala. Even songs were considered dangerous unless rewritten with ideological lyrics. Rosie, the girl born in captivity, thought every world event was orchestrated by Jackie, and that Bala could communicate with higher forces. It wasn't just a cult of personality, it was psychological occupation. Victims were convinced that Bala had supernatural control over events. Floods, accidents, even global politics, he took credit for them all. And the more absurd his claims became, the more his followers clung to him. Why? Because doubt meant danger. Doubt was disobedience. What would it take to break that illusion, and who would dare? Aravindan Balakrishnan arrived in the UK from Singapore in the 1960s to study at the London School of Economics. Back then, he was just another ambitious foreign student drawn to radical politics during a time of global upheaval. But while many of his peers grew out of the revolution, Bala dug in deeper. He didn't just want to talk about Marxism, he wanted to live it, and eventually control it. By the mid-1970s, Bala had split from mainstream Maoist groups and formed his own faction, the Workers' Institute of Marxism, Leninism, Mao Zedong Thought. Based first in Brixton, the group rented premises above a shop and attracted a handful of disaffected idealists. Their meetings were part political study, part indoctrination session. But behind the militant posters and fiery manifestos was a man increasingly obsessed with domination. He banned personal relationships among members, controlled what they ate, when they slept, and what they were allowed to think. Women were expected to serve the revolution and him. He taught that emotions were bourgeois weaknesses, and loyalty to the group and to himself was the highest virtue. When dissenters questioned his decisions, he labeled them CIA agents or imperialist spies and cast them out. The core group shrank, but those who remained became even more dependent. Over the years, he isolated his followers from the world. He convinced them that British society was on the verge of collapse, and only he could protect them. The outside world was a place of death squads, poison gas, and fascist plots. Inside his commune, however, he was the protector, the father, the prophet. And yet Bala never physically locked the door. His prison was psychological. His weapons were ideology, manipulation, and the slow erosion of choice. One question remains: why did no one from the outside ever notice? Control inside the flat didn't need chains. It ran on fear, myth, and the constant threat of punishment by fate. Survivors later spoke of a home rigged like a surveillance bunker. Cameras in every corner, doors that creaked ominously but rarely opened. Bala had installed a system where each member's movements were reported and recorded. Even the simplest action, like using the toilet, required permission. The women were made to believe that Bala was omniscient. If something was misplaced, he knew. If someone had a rebellious thought, he would call it out, publicly. He claimed to have psychic powers, bolstered by a fabricated entity he called Jackie, short for Jehovah, Allah, Christ, Krishna, and immortal Iswaran. This imaginary satellite system, he said, could mete out justice, track their thoughts, and destroy enemies from afar. Beatings were not frequent, but when they came, they were severe. One survivor recalled being slammed against a cabinet for speaking without permission. Another described years of sleep deprivation, made to stand in corners for hours as punishment. More chilling were the confession sessions, rituals where the women were forced to denounce their own thoughts as impure or treasonous. Rosie, who had never stepped foot outside, believed the world beyond their door was filled with gas attacks and secret agents waiting to kill her. Even the sound of sirens outside triggered panic attacks. Once, when police cars passed the flat during a protest, she cried for hours, convinced her time had come. Bala had conditioned her so deeply that reality no longer existed, only his voice. Still, in whispers, doubts began to form. In the quiet spaces between his lectures, the women started to ask, why hasn't the revolution come? Why is there only fear here? But could a lifetime of fear be undone with a single question? Rosie Davies had no birth certificate, no school records, and no medical history. She was, to the outside world, invisible. But to those inside the flat, she was the product of Bala's rule taken to its extreme, a child born into captivity, raised in absolute isolation, with no concept of normal life. Her mother, Cian Davies, had once been one of Bala's most loyal followers, but after years of questioning his authority in private, she mysteriously fell from a second-floor window during a holiday stay at one of the group's properties in 1997. She later died in hospital. Bala told the others it was an accident and no one dared question it. After Cian's death, Rosie became the collective responsibility of the remaining women. But in truth, Bala saw her as his possession. She was homeschooled, if one could even call it that, fed only his doctrine, taught to revere Mao and fear everyone else. He claimed she had cosmic significance, that she was destined to bring about a new era, but in reality he treated her like a prisoner. She was forbidden from leaving the flat, speaking to strangers, or expressing any doubt. When she misbehaved, she was berated, isolated, or slapped. On several occasions, Bala threatened to kill her. To reinforce control, he told her that her mother had been executed by state forces, and only he had saved her from a similar fate. And yet it was Rosie, despite her isolation, who would become the final crack in Bala's empire. As she grew older, her fear began to compete with her curiosity. She'd sneak glimpses at the world outside through tiny cracks in the curtain. She began asking forbidden questions, and slowly, without Bala realizing, a rebellion was forming, not with weapons, but with whispers. What happens when a prisoner, raised in total darkness, catches their first glimpse of light? The breakthrough came in a form no one expected, a quiet phone call to a small charity, Freedom. On the other end of the line was Josephine Haravel, her voice trembling. She didn't say much, just that 3 women were trapped in a house, unable to leave. She wouldn't give names, wouldn't say where. But she asked one chilling question: can you help us escape? Freedom Charity, led by Anita Prem, specializes in forced marriage and domestic abuse cases. But this was different. There were no chains, no visible captors, just a coded cry from someone buried beneath decades of psychological control. Working with the Met Police's human trafficking unit, Freedom devised a slow and delicate strategy. If they moved too fast, the women might vanish, or worse, retract out of fear. For days, undercover officers waited and listened. They coordinated with Josephine and Rosie via brief, whispered phone calls. The women had no mobile phones, just a shared landline they had to sneak to use. In one call, Rosie asked the charity worker what a passport was. That was the level of detachment they were dealing with. Finally, a plan was set. On October 25th, officers from the Met, posing as charity workers, met the women at a prearranged location away from the flat. It was the first time Rosie had stepped outside unaccompanied in her life. She trembled as she walked. Her eyes darted at passing cars. She expected Bala to appear at any second. When they were safely inside the protection vehicle, the officers still didn't fully understand what they were dealing with. But once the women began to talk, haltingly, painfully, a story emerged that would stun the country. And by nightfall, Balakrishnan and his wife, Chanda, were arrested. Why did it take 30 years for someone to reach out? And how many others never do? When Aravindan Balakrishnan faced trial in 2015, the courtroom sat stunned as the full scale of his regime was laid bare. The charges were unlike anything seen in modern Britain: cruelty, false imprisonment, indecent assault, child cruelty, and rape. Prosecutors painted a portrait of a man who weaponized ideology to satisfy his lust for power and control. A man who created a private world where he was God, judge, and executioner. Rosie Davies, now finally learning to live freely, took the stand. Her testimony was devastating. She described years of beatings, being slapped for looking out the window, denied contact with the outside world, and forced to accept that Bala's every word was law. She recounted how her mother, Sien, had tried to stand up to him, and died for it. Her story forced the nation to reckon with an uncomfortable question: how could such horror happen in a city as closely watched as London? Balakrishnan denied everything. He called the women liars, claimed they were trying to destroy him, insisted that Jackie was real and the British government was framing him. But the jury didn't buy it. In December 2015, he was convicted on multiple charges and sentenced to 23 years in prison. At 75, he would likely die behind bars. Chanda Patni, his wife and accomplice, was never charged. Though many believe she played a role in enforcing Bala's rule, prosecutors could not secure enough evidence to pursue her further. The women, now free, entered years of rehabilitation. Rosie struggled to adapt. Everything from crossing the street to using a smartphone was alien, but she pushed forward. This case exposed the limits of what we assume about freedom. Slavery in Britain didn't end in the 1800s. It simply changed form. Behind closed doors, control can wear any mask: Maoism, religion, love. This empire was collapsed, but as soon as one is destroyed, a new one is born. Somewhere right now, another house hides another prisoner, and we have to fight it before silence becomes their death sentence. A South London flat, a decades-long illusion, and 3 women who survived the unthinkable. Bala is behind bars, but the system that hid him still stands. If freedom can be taken with words alone, what will it take to protect it?